Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of OSAMP Live. We are going to be talking today about a pretty eventful summer for the LGBTQ community. So with you, generally, not always, is Amma, Assistant Director of Student Activities, and today we have two guests with us. Lindsay, I'm going to let you introduce yourself first, and then I will let our in-studio guest introduce himself. So Lindsay, you go first.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I am a rising sophomore at Emmanuel, majoring in political science and sociology, and I'm the public relations coordinator for Outspoken, which is Emmanuel's LGBTQ group on campus.
Excellent. And then with us here in studio is Eric Crumrine, who is the Director of Housing and Student Life at the Boston Conservatory. Eric?
Hi, everybody.
All right. So we are going to get started with a couple different topics that we have on the slate. And we're going to go somewhat chronologically. So we are going to start with late June when the Supreme Court same-sex marriage ruling came down. So how are you all feeling about how the legislation came down? Where were you when it happened? How did you kind of process that with people? And then what kind of impact do you think it's going to have on campus in your own lives moving forward? Whoever wants to start.
You can start if you want to.
All right. So I remember that day I was in my office. Of course, we all, you knew that it was potentially the day it was coming. So watching the SCOTUS blog on Twitter, just refresh, waiting for them to make that announcement. And I know when it finally happened for us, the office was fairly quiet. It was a Friday and no one was really around. The three of us that were there was a lot of shouting and excitement and all of that. It was just kind of one of those things that I remember probably 12 years ago being on the Ohio State House steps protesting the Defense of Marriage Act that just got put into law. So to see that kind of come all the way around and kind of joking like, oh, Ohio's gonna be one of those last ones to hold out and they'll never actually get it. And to be right, which was great, but then also to see that happen and know that it was there was really, really exciting. And then that night I went out with some friends to the Massachusetts State House where Elizabeth Warren was, and a number of other speakers were there, and it was a very celebratory day. So I think that day was just a lot of very exciting things, which there's still a lot to unpack, but I think the day itself was one that kind of gave that little bit of a sigh of like, okay, that's done. There's still a lot to do, but that's done.
That's awesome that you were protesting against DOMA. But this is so gay of me, but I was sitting on my couch watching the Women's World Cup when the ruling was handed down. And first my mom told me, she shouted down the stairs, Lindsay, you can get married now. And I totally cried because of course I did. But it was, I think the funniest thing about it was that throughout the entire weekend, I'm from a very conservative small town, even if we're still in Massachusetts. But everywhere I went that weekend, people who knew me were like, congrats on the marriage ruling, as though it was just for me and I was so special. But I think it was huge. I actually, my senior year of high school, made a documentary about the Goodridge case in Massachusetts, which is the same-sex court case in Mass, and about how that case set the tone and set all of the precedents for future marriage cases in the U.S., and one of the questions I got asked when I presented this documentary was, what do you think is next? Like how long do you think it's going to take for this to become kind of a national issue? And I said to them, I was like, it's going to be in the next 2 years because of how many cases were going to the court and how many federal courts had overturned marriage bans. And so I'm just super stoked that it happened so fast.
Well, and I think that's a valid question, is to ask, what happens from here? Because I think there were a lot of people that were very quick to say, this is big, this means that something really big is about to happen and that acceptance is just there, but it's not necessarily that simple. So do either of you see any additional struggles that will come along with this, or things that people may not have thought about at the very beginning when this ruling came down, which again is monumental, but like you said, Lindsay, in a lot of ways also kind of incomplete?
Mm-hmm. I think, first of all, it's obviously not the end of the road. There's so much more that needs to be done for the LGBTQ community. Like, you can get married or not married. You can get married in every state now. You can get fired in 30-something states just for being a member of the LGBTQ community. So there's no job security. And also only 55% of Americans even supported same-sex marriage before this ruling. But I think it's going to do for the LGBTQ community what it did for the African-American community when Brown versus Board happened and the court ended segregation. I think that it's going to do a long way in individuals accepting the community, and therefore when we get that broad individual acceptance, it'll kind of carry on to larger aspects of our society and eventually into our laws.
Sure. Eric, I know you have a little bit more experience with like the longer term history of it, so if you want to try to place it in that context as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, like you said, I remember, being there 12 years ago when DOMA in Ohio happened, which was one of those things that you're like, you already didn't have that right, and now they were just legislating that you really couldn't have that right. Mm-hmm. And so to watch that kind of progressively, slowly happen across the country, and always in for me, it was always kind of seemingly random places. Like Massachusetts happened first, which you're like, that makes sense. It's the East Coast. Like, this is where I will probably end up at some point in my life because you all got it right first. And here I am. But then I remember places like Iowa popping up, and you're like, how do I chart all of this? And there seemed to be a couple of years where it was like one or two, maybe a year. And then the last maybe 2 years, it would just be these waves of, suddenly 3 or 4 states were all turning at once, which was great. I remember doing a presentation on LGBT history, and on the Friday night before the presentation, I had to go and update all my slides because Utah had done something different, or there was things that were happening overnight that had to adjust things. And I think it marks politically a lot of progress and acceptance and openness, but I still know that even today, I'm seeing articles online about states or cities or places where people are just still flat out refusing to perform marriages. It's your job. You have to do this. And the state, courts are all coming down saying no, you've got to do your job, or you need to not be in there anymore. You can't pick and choose which marriages you're going to perform. So I think while in a big picture, it's one of those things when Barack Obama came into office, everyone was like, oh, we're now in post-racial America because we have a person of color in office. It doesn't really, that's not the change marker. Yes, we have this in a big picture, but there's still, that 45% that Lindsay was referencing that don't support what's going on, and people still having a really difficult time kind of processing this and being okay with the fact that I can get married even though it doesn't affect them. It only affects me.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had to take a guess, kind of looking at the larger landscape and things that are happening and kind of recognizing, like Eric said, that it started in small pockets and then started to happen faster in waves, what do you think the next rights issue on the horizon could possibly be based on what you're seeing?
I think my big guess would be, right now I think we're seeing it already, but a lot around transgender community, around making sure that they have protection, that there's non-discrimination laws put into place, and that in the workplace they're protected, they have access to health care. There's a lot of things that aren't there yet, but we're seeing, I think, a little bit more of that turning point with people like Caitlyn Jenner, Laverne Cox, kind of stepping out into the limelight and giving a face to a community that hasn't really had that spokesperson to really be there and be widely accepted by kind of the general population, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was going to say job security, because now that DOMA has been struck down, so there can't be any sort of federal interference with marriage, and then SCOTUS deciding that marriage was okay, that kind of the next step is going to be saying, well, look, they have all of these rights. You really can't fire them for being gay. And I think transgender rights play into that because so many people lose their jobs when it's revealed that they are transgender or they begin transitioning. And so I think that's part of it. But obviously healthcare is going to be huge, especially with transgender people. And in addition to that, with how we treat AIDS in this country, because we kind of don't talk about AIDS anymore, but it's still such a huge issue in the gay community, especially among gay men. And it's needs to be easier to access the medication necessary to treat it.
Sure. So real quick, and Lindsay, you may be able to speak to this a little bit more closely. What impact do you see this happening on campus? Do you see any heightened conversations that are going to happen, or maybe things that Outspoken is planning on doing in the fall to bring this up, even though it happened over the summer?
I think Emmanuel is such an awesome place that I personally have never felt any sort of issues regarding my sexuality or sexuality in general. So I don't think in that aspect it'll change, but I think Emmanuel is about to kind of blow up as far as gender identity in a good way, because I know we do have transgender students at Emmanuel, and we do have agender and non-gender conforming students at Emmanuel. And I think Outspoken's big push, at least one of my goals for Outspoken this year, is going to be making gender a non-issue. For a lot of people, one of the things that I want to try to introduce for professors is to have them start asking pronouns at the beginning of classes when they take roll for the first time. So such to the point that every professor is doing it, and it's just not a thing. It's just something Emmanuel does. I know Simmons has during their orientation at the beginning of their terms. They, all of their groups do pronoun usage, and I think it's an important step for Emmanuel to start doing. And I think being a Catholic institution, I have never experienced our mission and ministry being anything other than completely welcoming of the community, especially with the fact that our mission and ministry literally sponsors an LGBT retreat. So I think if anything, it's going to bring the campus in general closer because there's less of a dividing line.
Excellent. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that, and however we can help, please let us know.
Will do.
All right, so now I want to move into something that we've been kind of alluding to, so it's actually an elegant segue. We've had a lot of opportunities to see transgender representation in media. So the fact that the same-sex marriage ruling came out within weeks of Caitlyn Jenner formally kind of presenting herself through Vanity Fair, and then also I Am Jazz on TLC talking about a younger individual, I believe is 15 or 16, that's transitioning. And then kind of joining Laverne Cox, who people had been aware of since Orange is the New Black came out. So how has that looked to kind of see all of this kind of converging at one time, and all of this awareness and opportunity for people to see it excel and thrive in a couple different places?
Eric, if you want to step in.
Okay. I think it's kind of a twofold thing. I think first, it's obviously it's great that there's representation, that there are people out there that you can look to and say, like, these are people that are Caitlyn Jenner won an award. Laverne Cox has been doing great things with Orange is the New Black, and she's been very kind of public and outspoken about doing interviews and really pushing the envelope on making sure that interviewers are asking appropriate questions and that they're actually talking about the things that matter, and kind of redirecting some of those kind of inappropriate conversations about the physicality of what it means to be transgender. When I remember watching an interview with Laverne Cox, is like, that doesn't matter what is underneath my dress. Like, what matters is the fact that people are dying and that there's discrimination and that there are these things. And so I think she has been a very wonderful spokesperson to have out there pushing issues that are important and really diving into a lot of depth when it comes to the conversations around the trans community.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other side of it is kind of this unfortunate piece where these folks are coming in and they have a lot of privilege in the world. They have the ability to go through a transitional process, to have access to the things that they need. And not everyone has that. Caitlyn Jenner, I don't know that there's a family that she could be associated that could have more money than, the Jenner Kardashian excitement. And so there's a lot of privilege in being able to afford all of the things that she has,
Mm-hmm.
have, the healthcare access, and even just the things is like buying an entire new wardrobe of clothing, I'm sure was not a cheap endeavor, where, someone who's 16 growing up in rural Ohio isn't necessarily going to have that same access, and wanting to make sure that the experiences that we're seeing in television aren't painting kind of a misleading presentation of what it means to be transgender in the United States. And I think Caitlyn Jenner's show is trying to hit at some of that. I admittedly have only seen a single episode of it, but in the first episode that I watched, I know that there was already talk of, going to visit, I think, parents of a trans young person who had committed suicide, and talking about what that was like and what happened, and how in the future these kinds of things can be avoided.
Mm-hmm. I think I read this tweet yesterday that a trans friend of mine retweeted, and it said it's easier to get a job or to get a TV show as a trans person than it is to get a job. And I think that speaks to the fact that, you know, we started the year with someone like Leela Alcorn, you know, a teenage trans person who committed suicide because of the way she was treated. And we've kind of come into, you know, Laverne Cox blowing up, Janet Mock blowing up, Jazz Jennings blowing up, Caitlyn Jenner. And it's really speaking to the fact that being trans has become a commodity when you're famous or when you're somewhat known. And I personally am worried that it's going to become one of those things where you're like, oh no, you're perfectly represented. Like Caitlyn Jenner's right there. And these people aren't getting the access to the things that they actually need. And everyday people aren't getting access to the things that they need. But speaking to what Eric said about Caitlyn Jenner's show, speaking to it, their own privilege, to her own privilege, and speaking to kind of the lack of privilege of a lot of trans people, I've watched all of it because it's great. But they've really delved into the fact that there's one woman on the show who has applied to nursing school 6 times, and she's been denied each time, even though she makes straight A's at a great all-women's college. And when she graduates from her college, she's going to be the first trans woman to graduate, which is really exciting, but she's still kind of doesn't have anywhere to go now. But Caitlyn Jenner has been working to kind of make other trans women's stories more prevalent than her own, and using her voice to tell those stories, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, I saw that episode too, and how they had kind of said, basically Caitlyn then just went, whatever it takes to get her in, I'll do it, I'll take care of it. And I think that they did a really good job of saying, yes, this is something you can do, but then also kind of making her look very critically at the idea that that's not something everybody's going to be able to do. Not everyone's going to have that person that can jump in, kind of Oprah or Ellen style, and just say, we're fixing it, it's done, it's taken care of. So I like that the people around her have been supportive of her transition, but also been able to challenge her and say that your experience is incredibly unique. You're able to do a lot of things that a lot of people aren't able to do. You're accepted in a way that a lot of people won't be. So what will you do with that privilege? And I think that she's shown that she's doing pretty good things with it so far. She's aware of it and she pays attention to it.
Yeah.
She knows there's responsibility there.
For sure.
Yeah, and I know, like, and you know, you can start seeing some of the things trickling down. And I was chatting with Amma earlier today about, you know, even Target with their, you know, they've decided to eliminate the gender like labeling of toys in their store, which is fantastic and wonderful. And it's been a thing that's been kind of a long, you know, a number of, I think last year sometime there was, you know, the video of the little girl in Target being like, why is this my toy section? I want to play with these things. And like that started kind of a conversation. And I think that's really great, but it's been interesting to watch society freak out about the fact that toys are no longer appropriately gendered, because how on earth will they know what their little girl wants to play with if they can't walk down a pink aisle and pick out all of the things that are pink? And I think that kind of gets at more of a root issue that we've got when it comes around to even gender identity and trans issues, which is that we started this super early in terms of making sure that everyone knows where their kind of gender identity should be, which then later on makes it more difficult when someone comes out and says, but I identify as trans and that's what this means. And you get that kind of feeling of like, but wait, you've been who you are since you were so little, and where are we going with that? And I don't know, watching all of it kind of just erupt. There's articles everywhere online. If you just type in like Target gender neutral toys, some guy went online and like essentially trolled the Target page as like fake customer service for all these people that were freaking out. If you want a good laugh, that's really fun. But like, I mean, people's legit, like, it's, you know, again, like, how will I know what this little boy or little girl wants if I can't walk down an aisle that says boy or girl? And you have to stop and be like, well, why don't you just ask the child what they want to play with? Why is that such a hurdle? But I think being something like that, being such a giant thing for people to overcome, means that we're not necessarily as far working with the trans community, as things like Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, I think lead us to believe. That we're still so rooted in our binary of gender identity that while we're really accepting of their television shows, I think it's one of those things that I like it on TV, but I don't necessarily want it in my house.
Yeah. I was in New York this past weekend, and I went to the Whitney Museum, and one of the things that I saw there was that they had, you know, a female restroom, a male restroom, and an all gender restroom, which was like, what? That happens in real life? Like, it's not just something I wish my high school had, or I wish that my college can start having, which was really awesome to see. But I think to your point, I actually work at a summer camp, so I work with a lot of kids, and I obviously don't necessarily present like a typical woman, even though that's how I identify. And so I actually had a kid come up to me today and say, "Are you a Mr. or a Mrs.?" And they were just so earnest and legitimate. And I kind of felt bad for being angry at first, but it just so speaks to the fact that kids are socialized from literally like birth, even before then, to be a stereotype of their own sex. And they're not allowed to kind of explore what their gender identity might mean or how that might present itself. My parents were absolutely fantastic. My brother is gay. My sister is bisexual. I'm gay. So they kind of ran the gamut, but they let my brother play with Dorothy toys, and they let me play with Luke Skywalker toys, and it worked for us, and they just let us be us. And I wish every kid had that opportunity, because I see kids at camp who want to play with like certain toys, but it's a boy's toy. I'm not supposed to play with it. And it's just sad to see. It's sad. So I can't wait to see like my generation's children, and to see how much further we get from that, and how much more we are able to break down those barriers and the stereotypes.
And I feel like by continuing to bring up those conversations and being able to say things as that we don't think about, like how toys are sold, make a difference, then it means that some bigger conversations are probably going to happen later on. I know watching episodes of I Am Jazz, and they were talking about when Jazz was younger, knowing that something was up based on the toys that she picked. And I think that it's not going to be as simple to figure that out anymore. It's not going to be a matter of my kid picked one over the other, so they must be this. I think in a larger sense, it's going to be hopefully a more fluid conversation, because you won't have those clear markers, because it's just not going to matter as much. But it's kind of hard to know. It's hard to. Well, and I think we've hit upon a couple different pieces that could lead us into our next question, talking about how things kind of intersect. So, Lindsay, like you were saying with Leila Alcorn, transgendered individual who ended up committing suicide, and talking about how even though some transgendered individuals, largely in the majority, are kind of revered for what's happening, there's also an entire other side of that where transgendered women of color are in very serious danger in the prison system, even fearing for their lives at some point. So I think some of the revering that we're seeing and some of the excitement can be seen as being towards those who are white, but also going through that, versus those who identify as other races. So I know Eric and I have been talking a lot about the Stonewall trailer, the movie Stonewall that will be coming out this fall. Oh, we'll get to it, Lindsay. Let Eric explain it for those who may not be familiar with what's going on, and then we'll talk a little bit about what issues are tied up in that. So Eric, I will hand it over to you.
Sure. So I think it was earlier this week or maybe last week, the movie, the trailer, the first trailer for the Stonewall movie came out. And Stonewall, kind of referencing the Stonewall riots that happened in 1969 in New York City, which the following year led to the first Pride parade that happened. But this was a night where it was just people had enough. The police would come into the Stonewall Inn, and they would, which was a kind of club bar where the predominant audience and patrons were largely drag queens, trans community, and a number of folks within the LGBT community. One night, someone said, "Enough's enough. We've been tired of you coming in, raiding our bar, arresting all of us." And they started a riot. It started with someone throwing a brick through a window somewhere, and from there, the story goes, there's pictures of like drag queens with high heels and throwing shoes at people. And then this trailer came out, and I didn't even know there was a Stonewall movie coming out. So I saw this thing, it was like Stonewall trailer, and I got really excited. And then I watched the trailer, and it's about some white kid from Kansas who came to New York City and threw the first brick at the Stonewall riots. At least that's what the trailer and the way that it was cut and edited was leading me to believe that they were doing. And then I watched the internet freak out, like it does.
It's very good.
It's very good at freaking out. But it was, you know, and since that has come, you know, because the talk was that the first person to supposedly to throw the first brick, her name was Marsha, and I'm forgetting her last name because I'm terrible.
Marsha P. Johnson.
Yes, thank you. And then there was also another woman named Sylvia Rivera, and there was a drag king, Storm A. I think I'm probably butchering the name, but there was a third person as well, a drag king, who was also supposedly those three were right there at the front lines that started everything. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about a history that happened, and we've completely removed the trans women of color from that picture, and replaced it with a kind of cisgender white gay boy. Which, and you know, friends were talking about it online, and I was like, as someone who identifies as a cisgender white gay boy, even I'm gonna say like, and not like we're good. Like we've been dominating the media. Like we have Queer as Folk. Like that was like we've been present. We've been giving voice to folks. There's a time and a place, and there's also history and accuracy that needs to be kind of contended with. And since all of that came out, there's been a lot of controversy. There's petitions of people saying we're going to boycott everything. The director, the writer have both spoken out saying that we should all give it a chance and that marketing is marketing and not necessarily representative of the movie. And then I think the young gay boy who I keep referencing from the Midwest who goes to New York City has also released a statement saying, look, everybody, like I want you all to know we do respect the stories of these people and they will be present in the film, which I know at least two of them are not listed on the cast list at this present moment. And there are also only 5 people of color listed in the entire cast. So while the messaging we're getting is that we should all calm down, I am still suspect and look forward to the future trailers and whether or not they re-edit what that looks like and what the end product will be. Because at some point I will see it because I will need to correct everyone when I'm doing history lessons about, no, just because you saw the Stonewall movie doesn't mean that you saw any sort of accurate representation of what that story was. Mm. But Lindsay, looked like you had some thoughts when Amma mentioned the trailer. So what was on your mind when that came through?
Well, first of all, you were saying like the cast and kind of crew of the movie are saying like everyone needs to calm down. The only people who ever say you need to calm down when race is involved are white people, which means it's going to be an issue. Like it means that the movie is going to be terribly whitewashed and the stories just aren't going to be told. And this is something that has just kind of bothered me so much about the media and Hollywood version of the LGBTQ that acronym, the LGBTQ history of kind of the US, is that it's whitewashed and it's gay men. And no offense to anyone who might be a gay man, but it's rarely gay men who start this stuff. It's often trans women of color or queer women of color or queer women who start these sorts of things. And if you like went down a list of kind of characters who are queer for the last 20 years, it's going to be mostly gay men or it's going to be gay women who are psychotic. And that's just so bothersome for me because I think everyone obviously needs accurate representation, but one of the most at-risk populations in our society, which is non-gender conforming women or people of color, I shouldn't say women, but non-gender conforming queer people of color are kind of being just pushed to the side as though they don't exist. And like the reason kind of people like Laverne Cox and Jazz Jennings are able to be so successful is because they're very typically effeminate women. And so they're seen as more palatable to a general population. Whereas someone like Janet Mock, who is obviously like a very effeminate woman, trans woman, she kind of is more quick to be snappy and sassy and say no to a lot of these things, where Laverne Cox and Jazz Jennings are like, well, let me ease you into this. And I just think it does a disservice to every single person in the community, especially that at-risk population.
And I think it's a hard thing at any point when you kind of feel compelled to react when someone's trying to simplify something. And I think that being able to see this a lot over the summer with any number of injustices that have happened, people very quickly want to turn it into it's either this or that. And there's so many miles of gray area in all of these things where we kind of need to push each other to get a little bit uncomfortable and be supportive of each other as we're being uncomfortable. I think that a lot of these issues, as they get talked about, people aren't sure what to say, or they aren't sure how to support somebody who's having a hard time, and their default is to not do anything. So I feel like, particularly when Eric and I were talking about the Stonewall issue, Larry Kramer, who created an incredibly poignant portrayal of the early AIDS epidemic in The Normal Heart, talking about how people just shouldn't boycott. Like, be lucky any part of this is being represented, so how dare you try to say that they're not doing it right? And that's and that's a horrible thing to be able to say, is just, you're getting something, be happy with that. And to hear it from Larry Kramer, who's made such a significant impact, albeit for white gay men, but being able to put something in the forefront that's such a huge deal, we don't necessarily have to be happy with just what you get. You're allowed to push conversations a little bit further. So I know for me, like, having read that, and I know you saw it too, it was just very, very hard to watch that. Someone just so comfortable in the idea that they were supposed to be happy with something that they didn't feel like they could push it any further.
Well, and then you get to the double-edged sword of the idea of, like, we can all boycott this movie, but then if the movie tanks, they're not going to make any more movies. Like, they're going to be like, oh, well, the gay audience isn't there for us, so let's go back to focusing on our straight white guys, because people will show up for that. Because you want, like, the queer movie that's coming out. Like, you go and you sit through it regardless of how good or bad it's going to be, because you want to support the movie and see that going. The number of things I've watched on Netflix that were back in the days of, like, when you used to go to a video rental store way back when, like, going and getting, like, what ended up being kind of a, low budget. The acting was always kind of off, but you went, you supported it because you wanted more. So it gets that tricky spot where, like, if I go to this, if we all boycott this movie and we don't go, what is that going to then implicate in terms of future things that we will or will not get? And it's a struggle, because you want to, and again, like I said, I do a lot of presentations on history and I talk to people about things, and I'm going to need to know their point of reference when they say, well, I saw the Stonewall movie. So that way I can go, well, here are my list of things that were wrong with it. You should listen to this instead. Like, but I do think out of all of this, there's been a lot of light shown on a movie called Happy Birthday, Marsha Johnson. It's a documentary that's trying to be, I think, Kickstarted or GoFundMe, or one of the kind of crowdsourcing things that saw a huge spike in donations, because everyone was like, well, if the Stonewall movie pisses you off, let's go over here and you can fund this movie and maybe we can get an accurate telling of our story. But yeah, it's incredibly disheartening to see people like Larry Kramer, the director, and some of the people involved with the movie trying to tell us to all calm down. Because, we're allowed to be upset when you give us a trailer, and you can't say, well, the trailer is not an accurate representation of our movie, but the trailer is the thing that you're using to get me to come see the movie. And you clearly have created a narrative around this one boy whose story you're telling. And I want to say it was even cut where it's like, where pride began, and it shows him with a brick. And you're like, no, stop. Just stop. You're not helping. And I'm allowed to be a little upset about that when you're getting things wrong. I also got upset because they said where pride began. I was like, no, you missed a thing from 3 years earlier, the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco, which actually marked the first, like, trans riot that happened. But much like Lindsay said, we erase the things that aren't the white gay men, because there were white gay men present at Stonewall, so they're going to tell that story. And I don't think any of them were present necessarily at the Compton riots. So when you mention that in an educational setting or a conversation, people look at you like, I don't know what that is, and you're like, well, let's
like, why is that?
Right.
Why is it that those are the kinds of things that you don't hear about? And the same with this is when because even if you were to go out and talk to those marketing people and they say that the trailer is the best representation of what will get people to the movie, why? Why does it have to be a white male that gets people to go to the movies? And that's sparking a larger conversation about how we present things, what information people have and don't have, what they get to learn about what versus what ends up showing up later on because someone clued them in who had a little bit wider of a scope. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. I think that it's a little different because it's not race, but it's a gender thing, where the idea is like women don't go to see movies. Women make up 57% of the audience that goes and sees movies. And there is a huge issue with Marvel in refusing to give a female action hero her own movie. And they did an analysis of the opening weekend audience for the second Avengers movie, and 55, I think, % of the audience was women. They're saying the audience isn't there, or they say like men are more likely to go see movies. Well, the second Magic Mike movie had a 95% female audience. Women go to see movies. And so it's one of those things where white people are like, nah, movies about white people are the only good movies, because they aren't giving an avenue for people of color to make movies about people of color that aren't a Tyler Perry movie. Which, like, I love Tyler Perry. His movies are hysterical. But his movies can't be the only thing we see. Like Selma happened, and Selma was a fantastic movie. And it was nominated for the Oscar, and I personally thought it should have been more heavily contended for Best Picture. But, 12 Years a Slave won the year before, so can't have 2 black movies win in a row. Like, it's so stupid. And I get so mad at white people, and I'm a white person. I'm like, just, if it's race, you need to shut up. You have no basis to talk from, because the nature of racism is that only oppressed groups can get oppressed, and those oppressed groups can oppress the larger group. And white people are the larger group. And so when it comes to race, we need to take a step back and allow people to share their stories and grow in their stories, because up until recently, people of color weren't even really allowed to make their own movies and star in these movies. And so if you look at the history of film, people of color have such a shorter period in that history. And if you were to give them the same amount of time as white people have had, it would be on a lot more of an equal footing. But because they haven't been given the time, there's so much more of a gap. And so studio execs are using that as the excuse, and it's just ignorant and stupid.
Well, I do that because I'm a giant nerd, so I have to at least talk about Marvel for a second. And I think there's been a lot of criticisms of the things they've done. I'm excited that it seems like they're at least taking the feedback, though, because the next wave of their movies, and while I have to wait until like 2018 to get my Captain Marvel movie, she's coming.
It's literally the month I graduate from college, which is saying something. Like, It's going to be in a while. Right,
it's going to be a while, but at the end of, for those who haven't seen the Avengers movie, I will not spoil the ending, but at the end of it, they give you a picture of what the future of Marvel's looking like, and I think that was kind of exciting. Awesome. Right, so you're getting characters like Black Panther, you're getting Captain Marvel. Who's excited? They've already got screenshots of Black Panther in the next Captain America movie. Like they are progressing, which I think is at least exciting to watch. I know I was one of those people who I love Joss Whedon and bow down when he walks by somewhere. But even I could look at that and be like, Joss, I love you and you did a lot for women. But where were you in the Avengers movies? Where was that touch? It was more there in the first one. It lost it in the second one, where the women kind of, I don't know what they did to Black Widow. It pissed me off. I don't know. She was a really awesome character, and then suddenly she was there as the Hulk's love interest and calming device, which no. Yep. But at the same time, we're getting really cool shows. We're getting Netflix picking up shows like AKA Jessica Jones and ABC doing Agent Carter, and they're picking up steam, which is exciting to see. And then you've got DC that's just kind of doing DC's thing, and they've got Wonder Woman wearing next to nothing, and Lord knows what that's going to happen. What's going to happen with that? I think she's getting a movie, but I will remain skeptical.
Always be skeptical of DC, always.
But I do think there's a lot that we're seeing, and I remember when I was watching the Oscars, I think did Birdman beat out Selma for Best Picture?
It did.
And when I watched
Birdman,
and I was like, well, I get it, because it's about a washed up white guy actor who's trying to find himself and still remain relevant. And
AKA all the Oscar voters.
Yeah, it is. It's Hollywood.
Right.
Appreciate someone made a movie about us. No one's ever made a movie about Hollywood before, and it's a hard thing. And especially even me being somebody that studied film for years and looking at what was a really deep bench this year, being able to recognize it, like I saw Birdman, I saw all of the movies that were nominated that year except for American Sniper. I never got to it, but recognizing that there was something very significant in Selma not being, maybe it shouldn't have won because cinematic merit, that's an abstract concept, but being able to recognize that a lot of people didn't see it because they claimed they didn't have the opportunity, but it was there and you could find it. I went the day after it came out in New York, so it was the day after Christmas, and left sobbing, and everybody I know that went, it was a significant impact. Not the kind of impact you get from something like Birdman. It doesn't move you in the same way, but Lindsay, I know I thought the same thing when they were talking about the fact that 12 Years a Slave had won the year before, that was going to hurt it. And I knew that, and it broke my heart because it doesn't keep it from being a wonderful film in its own right, but they felt like they fulfilled something and could move on to something else. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I think, did I see today that the gentleman who played Martin Luther King is just been cast as the new James Bond?
In an audiobook. He's voicing him in an audiobook.
Oh,
and that, I guess that's all we can, no, it's fine.
Wasn't it Idris Elba is doing it in an audiobook?
Sorry?
Isn't it Idris Elba who's doing it? Not David.
Elba has been talked about to be the next one casted. But
Okay.
I think for the audiobook, I think for the audiobook, it's David Oyelowo, which I got really excited about. And those who follow me on Twitter will see that I said, excited that we're getting one in an audiobook, but we will take it for the time being. I'm not finished, but I will take it for now.
Yeah.
And I also know in terms of, kind of shows reaching larger audiences, I know the revival of Hedwig became a huge thing for all kinds of reasons. And right now you got Taye Diggs and Rebecca, her last name always escapes me, but she was in American Idiot and a number of other things. You got two people of color headlining a show that has not been done before in this way. And Taye Diggs is just going to be phenomenal. I mean, I've seen shots of him on set, and I want to go back down to Broadway just to see him play that role. I mean, that show's only been back for maybe 2-3 years, and they've cycled through a number of people. For the fact that you're getting a more diverse cast in a show of 2 people than you're getting in some of the larger productions that are happening right now is upsetting. But at the same time, it's really great that role was given to him to be able to bring a different sort of perspective to that. And talking about what that means to have him playing the role versus the cast of white men who've played before him is really fascinating to watch and kind of see where that's going.
And I know for my part, and we'll come back to Marvel for just a second, I think a lot of those changes are able to be made when people feel like the people that created it consented. Because I know John Cameron Mitchell, still being very much involved with the show, when Taye Diggs got involved, we're like, all right, well, the guy that made it said it's okay, so it must be okay. And again, with Fantastic Four, irrespective of the quality of the movie, I'm not here to speak about that, but the fact that there was so much outrage about Michael B. Jordan getting to be the Human Torch, and the biggest defense that he ended up making, and the one that people listened to, even over and above any other number of reasons that he gave, was that Stan Lee said that I could. The creator didn't have a problem with it, therefore it's okay. And again, that seems like a short-sighted way to be able to come at it, but ultimately that was the thing that made people calm down about it. Again, they got a little bit more upset when they didn't like the end result, but ultimately being able to do something like that by saying it's their decision. It can be anyone's decision. Anyone that's consuming it can have the opportunity to say, we want something more from the entertainment that we're getting.
Mm-hmm.
And you're seeing a lot of rise in that in the actual comics as well, because the comics are doing all kinds of exciting things. You've got Ms. Marvel as a Muslim woman from Jersey. You've got Thor as a woman, and they're not renaming her. Like, it's Thor, not like Thora or Thorette. Like, it's Thor. And I can't remember all of the, like, I think Spider-Man is currently Latino. Like,
Miles Morales.
Yeah, there's a whole new cast of characters in this universe. And granted, you have to have the access to get these graphic novels, which, each Ms. Marvel compendium that I want to pick up is like $20 a piece. But it's out there, and I think there's some cool places where people are pushing envelopes, and it may not be on the big screen, but they're kind of doing it in these ways that I think can have larger implications. Because like I read an article about how Spider-Man always has to be it has to be a white, straight male character, because that's what he is currently in the universe of Marvel. And if something of substance happens that changes, it can lead to a recasting of that character in a future movie. But because that's what he currently is in a certain set of the comics, that's the only thing that they can work with. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but I think it's cool to see Marvel being able to play with these things on the edges and have some latitude with that, which, for all we know, could have an impact in the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe movies that are coming out.
Mm-hmm. I think I personally am one of the people who actually like reads comic books because I never grew up, but in a good way. But like Captain America right now is Sam Wilson. Like Captain America is black, and of all of the characters in the entire Marvel lineup currently, Captain America has been that stalwart for like 70 years. And the fact that he's black now is huge. And on the point of Michael B. Jordan, I think it's great because from my understanding, Kate Mara's character, like Sue Storm, is the adopted one, and it's not Michael B. Jordan, which is a high five to, the creators of Fantastic Four, which I don't believe was the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't believe it's Marvel Studios.
Fox.
Yeah, which Fox, but I saw like Michael B. Jordan was in Fruitvale Station, which to me is one of the best movies I've seen in the past like 5 years. And he kind of had to have a similar media play when he was talking about Oscar Grant's story as he's had with this new movie. And I think he's kind of hasn't even really tried with Fantastic Four because of the experience that he had playing Oscar Grant. And he actually played a boyfriend of a white character on like a white girl on Parenthood, and he received a ton of backlash from that too because he was the black kid dating the white girl in California. And I think at this point he's almost tired of it, which is unfortunate, and just kind of goes to show the way media will go about race and the way people will go about race being depicted in film.
Well, and to kind of wrap us up, because I know we're running short on time, I think you brought a really good point up that I want to kind of run with a little bit. So I think that there can be a lot of fatigue in all of this. So recognizing that there are a lot of very hard things happening, things in terms of race, things in terms of sexuality, things in terms of gender, and being able to speak to all of those things intelligently every single time people ask, and being able to do so as though it's the first time you've done it every single time. And it gets difficult because it's super emotional and it means a lot to you, but to somebody for whom there isn't as personal of a connection, it doesn't mean a whole lot to them to ask a lot of questions and go to you as an authority on it. So for people who are a little bit concerned that they might run into that kind of fatigue, what would you recommend to them? And then what would you recommend to the people that have questions? What's the best way to approach that?
I think for me, with the fatigue piece, sometimes you have to step back. Sometimes it means not like, I don't know, there's times where after, like, you've been posting a whole bunch of things about the Stonewall stuff, and then another article comes out and you're like, I can't have that conversation one more time. Sometimes it means just taking a pause for yourself. Like, I've seen it posted, maybe I'll retweet it because that, I'm less engaging with that, or, I don't have to respond to all the messages that may come in with it. I think it's for yourself being able to, take a quick breath and allow yourself that moment, and knowing that you are not the only one that has to carry the torch all the time, and that there are people out there that are doing that, and it is okay to sometimes breathe. Because I know I got that a lot in my undergrad. I was one of the very out and vocal LGBT folks on campus, and time you get lots of questions and lots of things, and I'd always answer them and talk to folks and everything else. But sometimes it meant like, there's an event going on. I need to just take a breath for myself tonight. And I'm not going to go. That self-care piece, which is super important. And so I think for me, that's my big thing with fatigue, knowing where your threshold is and saying, I need to just step back for a second. And being okay with taking that moment. And then for people who are on the other side, I think, being genuine and trying to understand what is going on. I don't think, trying to be respectful in how you ask your questions. You don't come up to me and say, like, because you're gay, how do you feel about the Stonewall trailer? But instead, you already know that I'm gay. So to come up to me and say, hey, the Stonewall trailer came out. I have some thoughts about that. What are you thinking about that? And I'm happy to talk about it. We can dissect it. We can pull it apart. I don't need the qualifier that because I'm gay, I'm an authority on this. but more because I'm a person who has probably seen this trailer. How do I feel about that? And I think those are some nice ways to engage in that conversation.
Great, Lindsay.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, at Emmanuel specifically, I am one of those more vocal people. I am public relations for Outspoken, so I talk a lot about it, and I'm a retreat leader for our LGBTQ retreat, and I'm a sociology student, so I discuss it a lot, and I'm a political science student, so I discuss it a lot. So it's both kind of my personal life and my school life. But that's part of why I did like the little video series that I've been working on, because it's so much easier to be like, look, you have all these questions. Questions are fantastic. I want you to understand this group more and this community more. Here's a little video that is kind of a step into our world and what everything means. And it's so much easier to be able to point someone to a video than to kind of rehash the same thing over and over again, because it reaches the point where you yourself get frustrated that you have to explain it, and you have to be that torchbearer, and you have to be the person that represents the community. And I think almost everyone in the community feels like they have to represent the community, which is an unfortunate side effect of being a part of a marginalized group. But I think what Eric said about taking time for yourself is huge, because otherwise you'll just kind of become angry at the world, and you'll become kind of disenchanted with the world, and you won't be willing to put in the effort to make the world a better place, because you're going to constantly be facing those questions. But I think if you create resources for people to use that don't involve you having to answer 1,000 questions, then that can kind of both help people and lessen your fatigue and stress.
Excellent. And to that end, as we post this episode, I'll make sure that we add the links to Lindsay's videos so that you all have the opportunity to watch them and get some preliminary questions answered. So as you come back in the fall, if you have questions, some of those will be answered there, and then the rest will be available to you through a number of campus resources, not just Outspoken.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Lindsay, both for being with us to have this conversation. It's been great talking to you. It's been a fun conversation, even though there have been some hard things involved with it. But I look forward to talking to you both more about this, and to seeing things happening on campus over the course of the year through Outspoken.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Thank you for having us, Amma.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We'll see you all again soon.